Now that set 10 has launched and a lot of people already know what are the top comps and carries in the game, there's also a bunch of other situational or more conditional comps that are really powerful, but only if you know how and when to play it. Let's go ahead and dive into the most underrated and underplayed comps that I think are also really strong in that A and B tier that you could be prepared for any situation. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Mobalytics, who is helping bring you guys this video. Mobalytics is a dedicated data website to help you find the analysis and edge you need to climb. Check out their stuff at mobalytics.gg/TFT, where you can find compositions by myself, Dissop, and many other top players in North America. By downloading their overlay, you can get meta comps in-game, as well as look at different community comps and my own compositions I'm using to climb. It's also the overlay that I use that recommends me real-time data of augments, as well as other information happening in the lobby, so that I can stay up to date. Download the app so you can get your best set 9.5 comps in-game with the Mobalytics overlay. Before we start, I want to let you know that A and B tier comps doesn't mean that it can't do well. It just means that there are more conditions required for you to have success. Otherwise, chances are you're just going to be gambling and hoping that everything falls your way, which is okay if you want to have fun. But if you want to climb, you want to try to have the proper conditions set up so that you can have maximum chance of success. This is the key to how a lot of top players like Dissop, for example, climb, because he understands the conditions for all the A and B tier comps. If you want to be like Dissop and hit rank 1 every set, you have to know the conditions of when you can play his comps instead of hard forcing it. That way, no matter what Mordark throws at you, you'll be resistant to variance. Disco Dazzlers featuring Twisted Fate is a very solid comp that was terrorizing all of PBE, but has since got nerfed a little bit. And now it's not nearly as popular, but it's still really strong. And when it hits max cap, it feels like an S tier comp, which goes to show you that this actually has a lot of potential to win out lobbies. The problem with this comp is twofold. One, it's really expensive to hit because you need Twisted Fate, and you definitely need to hit some of these legendaries that are really good, like Ziggs, to get that full Dazzler value. If you're still relying on things like Bard and Nami and Lux to deal most of the damage, and you don't have a Twisted Fate too, you basically won't kill anything. The other part that's really hard in particular is that Blitzcrank is an incredibly contested unit. And because you're so dependent on having a good frontline with Blitzcrank 2, if you don't have it, you can often struggle a lot in the mid-late game. The core concept is pretty straightforward, where you just have Blitzcrank as almost a solo frontliner, and you have Twisted Fate tucked in the corner here. You do have the option of moving Twisted Fate to like the hard corner sometimes, but just keep in mind that this sometimes makes him vulnerable to like a Kayle and Lux, so you have to be very careful about how you position. Second element that I want to talk about is when to get Disco Ball value versus not. The way to think about Disco is very similar to Jade from the Dragonlance set 7 set. If you guys remember when you played Jade and you got Shio and you got all this kind of stacking attack speed and healing, this is also the same thing. You get stacking attack speed and healing throughout the entire fight, meaning the longer the fight goes, the more attack speed you're going to start ramping on to things like Twisted Fate and all the other units. And so you're going to be thinking about Disco in this way where it's a scaling trait. And so you need things that help stall and give you that time, so that way you can get that ultimate Disco snowball and have a ton of attack speed. Ziggs is also a really important AP champion for damage. A lot of times people think they just keep Twisted Fate with items and then they like splash like an item on Senna and an item on the Ziggs. And maybe if you play Lulu in the composition, for example, with Spellweaver, you also just put like a Lulu in and then you give her like a random, Shojin or something like that. In reality, Ziggs really wants items. Ziggs' best item set is Shojin plus Nashor's Tooth and then an AP item, but a lot of times you just give him like literally whatever, like I don't know, maybe a guard breaker as well, who knows. In the end, you just want Ziggs to also get that damage in. The other thing to consider is Ziggs' ability, which also reduces the magic resistance of your opponents alongside Twisted Fate's ability as well. So while you could go for something like a static Shiv, don't feel like if you don't have Shiv or Spark, like you're going to be in trouble late game. You still have that magic resistance reduction. At the very top end, it's actually really important at level 9 to play Alawi, because you have a bruiser with the Disco of Gragas. So by playing Alawi, you get these tentacles that give you a ton of frontline. Not only did they chew through a Blitzcrank, but now they have the tentacles that help stall and scale your composition further. Another question is, when do you end up greeding for Disco value on all your units versus not? And the answer is oftentimes matchup dependent. Sometimes you just really don't want to have all your units clumped up, because then AoE CC like a Thresh can really punish you. So you can spread out. A couple of different things you can do. For example, if you're going up against a Kayle, Lux, you can put these tentacles in the back, put this Disco somewhere like in the middle in the back, and then play sort of like you're almost like KDA where you're stacking up vertically. This is like one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is stack on one side and have like a tentacle in the corner here, and then therefore make yourself a little bit more vulnerable to a right side flank, but it ends up being really good corner bait. So just play around with this idea. Positioning is still something that's like an evolving thing in set 10. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to look back in this video and be like, wow, that was like dumb. I suggested that. But part of it is experimentation and figuring that out. One thing I do want to know is Hyper Pop does end up helping a lot too, so make sure whoever your closest ally is after casting ends up getting that attack speed buff. You don't really want to get buffed on the wrong units. So his best mode is probably the heal and shielding allies because it stalls really well with that disco. Disco will give you that inevitability, so you don't need things like that ability power, and you don't need that attack speed for that same reason. I mentioned this comp as a variation of any reroll on the S tier, and it's starting to pick up more popularity, specifically EMO Karthus in tandem with Vex. This is actually a really powerful composition in particular because you have a couple different variations you can play with extra guardians, or you can go for moshers if you end up hitting a Poppy 2 with really good items. Poppy is a really underrated unit in general, and for good reason. She's not particularly very good, but if you build around her very cleverly, she can actually get a lot of work done as a mosher. If you're in a spot where, say, you can play for like sets and you get, you know, a +1 mosher on a Poppy, for example, you could totally play around this concept and find a way to get 4 mosher and then have her pop off with specifically really strong items that synergize with her ability and passive to get a lot of HP. If you get Warmogs, Steadfast Heart, and Steady's Gauge, this is really, really good on Poppy. But a little bit less about that. It's really about Vex and Karthus to start things off with the emo as well. So it feels kind of nice to just call this an emo comp as opposed to like a Vex comp or Karthus Vex or Poppy and Vex as well. It's kind of the sum of its parts because of all of the mana that you get. You just get so much mana as a team that you end up casting a lot, and it's quite solid. Karthus is best with these items with having the emo emblem and then just giving him AP of some sorts. You can give him Death Cap, you can give him Archangels, you can give him a Jewel Gauntlet, pretty much anything for the most part. And then for Vex, because you have so much mana through the emo trait, you just want to get AP on her. If you get Jewel Gauntlet plus Archangels and Death Cap, that's probably close to her best in slot items because you don't really need that mana for her to cast a lot. You can also go for Gunblade if you want to heal your frontline as well. If you do have an opportunity to go for 6 emo, it is absolutely worth it. 6 emo is very, very good, and particularly if you go for Vex 3. The only thing is that you have to hit Annie and then get a chosen emo, which is a little bit specific. In the end, you're also playing like an Annie, which is not that good of a unit. But if you end up having this situation set up where you hit, you know, 6 emo of some kind, it ends up being very, very powerful. Positioning is pretty straightforward in terms of the front to back. You just pretty much try to space it out. If you ever sense like an Akali coming, just put Karthus in the middle or Vex in the middle. And remember that Vex also has that 1 hex radius of stun, so you can try to use that to try to navigate through a front line. If you end up getting a Guardian Emblem, it's also end up being very good on a Alawi as well because it gives her a bunch of tankiness. And if you end up getting something like this, you'll probably end up winning the game. But until then, if you don't have Alawi, you can go ahead and play something like a set, so that way you get the Bruiser and Moshers, and that's the way you can go for like 4 Moshers in the mid game. And you also notice that you have 2 Pentakills, so you can also play a Gnar here. Let's say you don't have this Annie, and instead you're going to go for Gnar, and you're playing a comp like this instead at level 8. This is also totally fine as a potential variation. The early game often looks a little bit like this, where you have Annie and a Mumu, and then you either have like a +1 Spellweaver, so you end up playing another Spellweaver like a Seraphine, for example, or let's just put this Lulu here for measure. And then you put like another Guardian like Kennen, and you can play around Superfan, and you can do like a bunch of different things with this kind of transition into the Mumu board with Vex later in the game. Speaking of Karthus and whether or not you want to play Pentakill and some of those splash comps, Karthus is very good with the vertical Pentakill if you're able to get Viego and specifically a Pentakill emblem. In this variation, we have this Olaf here just to show you what it looks like without it. But if you do find your way into a Akali with Pentakill emblem is no joke. Actually very, very strong. Because she ends up getting the damage reduction from the Pentakill, and when she also starts getting all that bonus damage, it can start to snowball really quickly. So I end up really liking specifically this setup if you get Pentakill Akali. But as you can see, the comp is very expensive because you also not just want this, but you maybe want to tie in a Sentinel like this Blitzcrank, for example, and you definitely want that Yorick. So Pentakill is a very difficult composition to pull off. The cap of it is insanely high. I believe 10 Pentakill is definitely like averaging like a 1.2 or something like that. So if you're able to get 2 Pentakills, get for 10, that's a win, but very impractical to get. Usually you end up going for this if you either are rerolling something like Kayle and Gnar, and you go for like 3-star Gnar, 3-star Kayle, go for a bunch of Pentakill. Hey, guess what? I have like more Pentakill emblems. Now I throw some extra items on Karthus, etc. Ends up being like a way you can go about it. The other is if you're fast aiding and you're holding like these generic items, let's say you slam like a Shojin and an Archangels, or you're playing like Adaptive JG, these kinds of items, and you're like, hey, I want to play for Ahri, or I want to play for Karthus, or I want to play for Twisted Fate. Like these are all different carries that you can use things like Shojin, Archangels, JG, and it's totally flexible. The only downside is if you end up rolling for a fast 8 and you end up hitting Karthus and you have to start building Pentakill from there, you're much more likely to play like 5 because it's going to be hard to dig out things like Olaf, Gnar, and Kayle to get that verticality of it. So chances are you're probably going to play like 3 to 5 as opposed to 7. And that 7 Pentakill is kind of important in the sense that that's where it starts to get nutty in terms of that damage, which is why you want that Pentakill emblem. So if you can get that Pentakill emblem, good to go. Mord 3 is definitely very valid as well. We talked about this in another video. Mordekaiser 3 is very solid, but pretty contested whenever people are just playing around it in their other variants of comps that feature Karthus, or they're just playing a Sentinel frontline. Positioning, you notice that this Kayle and this Karthus are next to each other. This is actually not entirely necessary because Kayle does shred, but Karthus, you know, he targets whoever he wants for the most part. He targets the lowest health enemy unit, so sometimes it's going for backline, and that Akali for the wipe is really, really huge. Yorick, by the way, doesn't want that many defensive items. I mean, you can give him like Warmogs, you can give him like, you know, Bramble Vest, and this is totally fine to play on Yorick. But in reality, if you're able to get like the Viego type items on him, like Hodge, Titan's Resolve, and a Sterix Gauge, Yorick can actually be your top damage dealer, which is something that you don't even really see unless you're looking for the ghouls and noticing how much damage they deal. So top end, this has a ton of potential to pop off and a very strong composition if you're able to get that Pentakill emblem and everything online. It's just very, very pricey. Spellweavers are an interesting spot because I think that they cap really low unless you're able to 3-star like a lot of things and set up kind of like a team-wide threat. It's almost like you never have enough tiers and rods for this comp whatsoever, because beyond just itemizing the suggested Ahri and Lulu and even the Senna, you also sometimes play around Seraphine 3. So you're playing like Seraphine 3, Lulu 3, and Ahri 2, and you want items for all of them. It kind of gets out of control very quickly. But make no mistake, 7 Spellweaver is very powerful, and you can also play it with that anti-reroll version that we talked about in the other video. And this variation, you just play like a fast 8 style, going back to what we were talking about before, which is you're playing around Karthus, you're playing around Ahri, you're playing around Twisted Fate. So in this composition, you're often looking for a lot of mana augments because you just want them to cast a lot. Spellweaver 7 in particular is really powerful because every time you cast, you get an additional 2 ability power. And that's whenever any single individual Spellweaver cast, all of them gain ability power. So they're almost like ramping each other, which ends up becoming very nutty with that blue buff. Oh, if you're taking things like Infusion and Cybernetic Uplink and other things that help get you that attack speed, that blue buff in combination with it can be really good. And also that does mean that if you end up stacking multiple mana items, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. I've seen people, for example, go for, you know, blue buff and Shojin, or a Nashor's Tooth Shojin build. And that's totally fine on some units as long as you have multiple threats. In a lot of ways, I draw parallels to Heart from set 8, Monsters Attack, where every Heart unit that casted with Soraka and other units like that end up help ramping your ability. It's very similar to this, where the longer you stay on the fight, the more likely you're just going to overwhelm your opponent. Tank items usually go onto Echo, and you can roll for Echo 3, but he is a hard unit to hit because of how tied he is to some other compositions. Feel free to also itemize a Zac, or in this case, in the very top end, if you're somehow able to find an Alawi. As you know, Alawi is the best bruiser in the game and gives you a ton of frontline. And now you're in a really good spot. I would say that overall, though, this is like weaker than the KDA version of Ahri. I'd rather go for Ahri plus Akali, but this is also something you can do if you just end up hitting like a bunch of AP and tier items nonstop. And you're like, well, what do I do? I don't really want to play AP Akali because that's not a thing. You can just do something like this. Lulu 3, by the way, is a little bit on the sus side. Sometimes I wonder if Lulu 3 is kind of bugged because I feel like sometimes she like completely pops off and then sometimes she doesn't do anything. So I will say that Lulu 3 is not nearly as worth chasing. But if you do have a headliner Seraphine, you can go ahead and give her items like this Nashor's Tooth, like this Shojin and JG, and watch her pop off as well. Best Sona mode, this might be one of the few times I actually want to take attack speed on Sona because I want to get mana as fast as I can. And the faster you attack, the more mana you generate. You generally don't really need to like heal and shield as much because you're much more of a burst-oriented composition that ramps. And then you also don't really need ability power because you have so much of it. So this could be one of those times. I think in a lot of situations, though, people end up taking healing, shielding because, you know, in the same way of stalling out the composition where the longer the fight goes, you get more AP. Maybe someone ends up feeding into that strategy. EDM has a couple of variants that you can play. There's one that's listed right here, which is a Jax reroll composition variant where you end up playing crit Jax with Jewel Gauntlet, Hand of Justice, and Titan's Resolve. You sample Jax, and then you end up having Jax bounce around with his ability, and then you end up just kind of whittling things down over time, emphasizing around monsters in particular. And then this is where like Poppy can again be a really good support carry, as well as Zed carrying the usual with like Infinity Edge, BT, plus, you know, ideally like an Edge of Night or something along those lines. Definitely don't ignore things like Edge Knight on Zed. So that's Jax in a nutshell. If you want to play around Lux as your sample, you want to give her AP with Shojin so that she can ramp up the mana and also cast a lot. You can even go for things like the Nashor Tooth as well if you want. That's just one suggestion, but you can also just go for, you know, say a death cap, and that's totally fine. And if you do end up having that, you want to make sure that one, you're able to have good front lines. So a lot of times this set isn't really good enough. And because you're playing around things like Lux and not around Jax, that monster is not relevant. So in this spot, I would rather go for an Alawi, obviously, because you're playing any bruiser, you want Alawi. You can also, instead of say playing around this, let's say you're not finding Alawi, you can go ahead and play around Guardians as well. Things like Thresh as well as a Yorick can also provide some decent frontline, and then you can blast through with extra Dazzlers. Make sure you get that Ziggs in, and then ultimately whatever Dazzler you can fit in after that. And there's also some variants that you can play too with Disco if you end up hitting, you know, Gragas, for example, and then you get that Disco in with Twisted Fate, like so. And then instead of Bard, you play a Nami. And this is a way that you can play around Lux as a potential Dazzler. You can even do things like put this in the front line. Ignore the Jax items. I'm just kind of showing you different variations that you can play with the EDM. You end up doing something a little bit kind of like this, although you're probably going to be lacking some front lines. So you have to be very careful. Sometimes you sub out this Jax, you play like 40 EDM instead, and then you play like a more solid frontline unit. There's even some other tricks you can do, by the way. If you end up sampling Lux, you can even trap units in the corner. Sometimes what people do is they put like Lux here in the bottom left, and then they tuck in their Jax on the bottom right, where they trap the Jax because these are 4 hex range units, and they attack the front line. And then Jax ends up casting the Lux ult and almost like dealing the damage equivalent to Lux and doing like a nice little X laser beam cross. I've seen people do this and it looks kind of like a meme, but it's sometimes kind of good. I've lost to it a couple times and I can't even tell if it's really good. So experiment with it if you want. The only downside is you're kind of down frontline already and the composition can struggle with it. So I'm a little bit skeptical that it could work, but ultimately it's really up to you whether or not you feel like it's really good. And also if you're really feeling like you're lacking frontline, just cut the Dazzlers and just add more frontline like we talked about before. As for the Zed variants, you want to play around crowd divers, going back to that Katarina reroll. Just basically look at every crowd diver and just add them. It's actually that simple. You hit a crowd diver Zed, you add in all the crowd divers, you basically just play crowd diver EDM, and then you just position Zed so that he can't get blown up. You add in a bruiser of some sort instead of this Jax. One thing about crowd divers in general that I want to say if you're playing around Zed is that you can sacrifice some of them, because they end up being nice like intermediate CC where they jump to the corner and they stun them, an AoE effect. And if you stagger it, let's say you play like Evelyn in the corner, she dies, she jumps to the corner, stalls. You play Yone, he dies, he jumps in the corner and stalls. And it ends up becoming a nice way for you to stall out your opponent carry just for a little bit, and then Zed can kind of systematically work through to the back line. Zed, by the way, does dash a little bit, kind of like he's a challenger from previous sets where if he gets a takedown, he like dashes to the next opponent. That doesn't actually happen consistently, so just be mindful that as much as you're expecting Zed to go a little coast-to-coast action, he can be a little bit wonky. If you do end up getting chosen Crowd Diver Zed, though, and you get 6 Crowd Diver online, it is exceptionally good. So you do have to have a lot of things go right for it to be successful, but right now, it doesn't seem that consistent, so I probably put this actually closer to A/B tier than actually A tier. Speaking of A/B tier, this is a composition that fluctuates between being like something that feels awful to maybe being top of A tier or potentially S actually sometimes. And that depends on like whether or not you're able to navigate a fast 8, fast 9 based off of Ezreal flex. Ezreal big shots really depends on just having a versatile front line. You can play like Sentinels, you can play Bruisers, you can play Guardians, you can play 4 of something, you can play 2/2/2 of something else. It's really entirely flexible. Here's just a recommendation of like, if you're able to pick your units of what you really want to do, it probably end up being something kind of like this, where you have Blitzcrank fully stacked, and you have Jhin and Ezreal having full items, and then maybe even leftover items for like an Alawi with the Bruisers. If you do end up hitting a big shot +1, instead of having this Kai'Sa, for example, I would recommend actually just more frontline, because in reality, with these 3 big shots and you're able to itemize 2 of them, they end up being very, very good. But this is like kind of a rich get richer, hedge fund, level up, you know, going long, like all those kinds of like heavy econ augments where you're able to fast 8, fast 9. You know, cluttered mind and things like that. Definitely try to keep yourself open to the possibility of playing Ezreal if you have a really strong AD open and a bunch of AD items. The cool thing about Jhin, now that they buffed his mana, is that he can actually use blue buff and Shojin fairly well. I like blue buff a lot more than it because of the damage amplification, but If you're able to get blue buff specifically onto Jhin, he'll end up casting a lot. Another little quick tip is that you actually want Jhin usually on the same side as your opponent's carries that take a long time to ramp up, because the violins will target based off where Jhin will shoot next. And so if Jhin kills, let's say this tentacle represents the front line of the enemy unit, Jhin kills this unit, then there's nothing else here in the center. He's going to target the top right with his violin. Ezreal also tends to really punish clumps. So as people get better and de-clump towards the late game, Ezreal gets worse. The one thing I will say that's actually very cool, let me show you a variation of something that you can play. And this is actually some cool tech. Let's say you're in the middle of the game and you are very healthy, but you recognize that you're probably going to start falling off. And you also want to like greed between level 8 and level 9. You're like, hey, I'm like too strong to roll because I have like 2-star Ezreal. I have 2-star frontline, but I have like 1 Jhin. And, you know, I just feel like in this spot, I have to go to like level 8, level 9. You can actually play Heartsteel starting from the end of stage 4 into stage 5 and almost play it like a golden egg cash out. What I mean by that is Heartsteel gets more and more ramping as the game continues to go on. So if you do have that HP and let's say you hit something like Heartsteel Ezreal, by all means, go for like a 5 Heartsteel setup and then go for those heart multipliers and get like a big cash out and trade like 40, 50 HP so you can get like a massive big spike, almost like you just unleashed a golden egg. This is some pretty risky tech, so I highly suggest doing this only if you really know what you're doing and also you are very confident you're not going to die and blame it on me. And if you blame it on me, you know who to blame instead. Dogmort. We talked about big shots. Here's another variation that you can play of a reroll composition. Corki did get a pretty sizable buff, and the only time I'd ever play around it is if I get fed Corki 3, because Corki ends up being one of the premier early game item holders. You're often buying a headliner Corki just to have strength on your board and play it into a bunch of other compositions. Let's say you're in a spot where you hit 8-bit Corki and you have like Corki 3. Should you play it? Absolutely. You're going to play around Corki and you're going to play around Garen. That's going to be the duo that holds most of your items. And then Caitlyn gets leftover AD, which if I were to pick and choose would probably be something like Shojin, IE, and probably a Giant Slayer. The Shojin helps her cast a lot faster, and because 8-bit gives you so much AD, you don't need things like Deathblade. You just give her things that amplify that damage, like crit and bonus damage. Nice thing about this is you can also tie into Lucian for a little bit of jazz synergy. And because you're playing like 4 Sentinel in this spot, you end up dropping it and you flex into other traits that kind of make sense and all tied together. So maybe you add in like a Bruisers, as we talked about, which is really strong with Alawi and the Zac, so you can get like a pretty good diverse set of synergies online. Or you could also just kind of flex around whatever you're hitting and maybe even go vertical 8-bit. Speaking of, vertical 8-bit is pretty solid. You just have to get 8-bit emblem onto this Lucian unit like so, and 8-bit Lucian is very good. So if you get 6 8-bit and you're able to get Lucian online, you can win the lobby. This is just another out for you to think about if you end up playing a Corki, but it is like probably firmly B tier because I'm never looking to play this unless I just get fed infinite Corkis off of a line where I was just starting to look at other units anyways. Like I end up playing Corki a lot of times to go into Misfortune and like, hey, 9 Corkis. Let's just make it happen. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Riven, Yone, Edgelords were so dominant for most of PBE on set 10, but now at launch, they are pretty bad. The only reason why is because this comp, if it gets everything, and I mean everything online, you hit Riven 3 and Yone 3 and you 2-star stuff and you hit this Kayn, you can win lobbies. It's almost like insanely dominant how fast it wins. Like because Edgelords kind of are like challengers from previous sets where when they win fast. They like overwhelm your front line. They crush through targets, and then Riven Yone just like get to the back line, assassinate your targets, and you have nothing to do. So this is a really potentially strong composition to play, but it's just so expensive to get online, and you need to get that Riven 3 and Yone 3. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people like hit Riven 3 and they're like, oh great, I'm stable, and they like win, lose, because Riven 3 just can't kill things fast enough, and then high DPS targets like a Jinx 3 just locks onto Riven and then she dies. And then here's the other aspect. She's pretty item dependent. You really need to have Riven have BT Titans and QSS. And Yone should also have items as well. And also, if you can, get things like Thief's Gloves or leftover items onto Viego. And also, you really want to hit things like that Kayn. So it's pretty problematic. The only times I feel like I would ever play this is if I hit like a reroll oriented composition, or I'm streaking so hard with, you know, like I have have Riven too early and I have so much economy and I'm win streaking that I can afford to slow roll and get things online because I have such a big lead. This composition has immense potential. It's very, very high cap, but the difference between hitting and not hitting is like top 2 and 7th and 8th. You could theoretically play around Yasuo as well if you end up hitting like an early Yasuo headliner and you want to play around that and give him the items, but even then, I'm a little bit skeptical. If you were to play around it, you would go around like Yasuo plus super fans, and then you have like Edgelords Tecton slowly. That's one way you can go about it. But in reality, I think that this comp is just going to need a little bit of love and buffs before it gets a little bit more consistent. That being said, be very careful when this composition becomes good because people hated losing to it and people just get super overwhelmed. Also, one thing I want to point out too is make sure Riven and Yone are on the same side, and because Edgelords are gaining attack speed when their target drops below a certain HP threshold, aka you kind of want them to attack the same target because then they're getting the same attack speed buff. The last of the rerolls that I want to talk about that's kind of like in that A-B tier is Gnar, which is dependent on one of the 3 traits that he gets. If you get Pentakill Gnar, you end up rerolling Kayle a lot of times and going like a vertical Pentakill as I showed in the setup. But I'm also showing some Moshers because if you get a Mosher headliner, you can roll into 6 Moshers, play 3 Pentakill instead. You would not play Kayle in this spot and you would roll for Urgot. And then if you go for a super fan, you play 5 super fan Gnar and you play a Pentakill core around that as well. It's a little bit hard to show it all on one board simply because I think I am limited on units, but the 5 Superman version would be play around, you know, Pentakill and Moshers. A lot of times you don't have this Viego, it could just be anything else. And you play like a 5 super fan version of Gnar reroll as well, so you get that rating item. Ends up being a cheap way to get tempo. And so it's like a really interesting comp to keep an eye out for. I ended up playing it one time on opening day and I got a first with it because I played vertical Moshers, but I do know that superfan variants are also viable, and I also know that Pentakill variants are really viable. So if you want to explore and master like, you know, a Gnar one trick and you really want to do it, go ahead and toss it out. I'm just sharing some tech, and I know that Gnar 3 is viable with all 3 of his traits. Just have to build around it for the most part. I'm revisiting this Senna comp as a tempo true damage composition where you're really able to get a true damage emblem early. This is actually a very strong composition if you're able to get it online and you're pushing high tempo, win streak, and levels. This is because if you're able to somehow get to an early Qiyana with 6 true damage, you can snowball the game and actually end in a first place by having just way too much stuff and overwhelm your opponent. The main best user of the true damage emblem is Karthus because he pairs with the true damage Akali. And this spot, you would go for a true damage onto Karthus and then give him the usual stuff like an adaptive or a Shojin or whatever and get him some mana. And then Akali in this spot would go for the other usual items that she wants, like an Edge of Night and a Hodge, as well as an Infinity Edge. If you're able to get something like this set up, and remember, this is a different true damage Kali than KDA Akali, it's very, very powerful, and you kind of want to blitzkrieg a unit as fast as you can to get to the back line. And don't forget that you could reroll Senna, but chances are you're probably not going to. You're just going to have Senna 2 in this spot. You're able to find a way to just stack up items, push levels, get to 9, and then find other really strong legendaries, and you can just add in the usual suspects. Slowly take out things like the super fan, for example. Take out like 1, 2, 3, and you just have 6 true damage, and just play around whatever you get that makes sense. Sentinel with Blitzcrank, that ties into Echo. Lucian, that has Rapidfire, that goes well with Senna. Maybe you play Alawi and Zac, and then you have Bruisers as well. You have a lot of options to kind of build around that, because true damage gives you a ton of offense. Just make sure you surround it with some utility and defense. It's not a terribly complicated comp either. Usually the way you start this off is you get like a headliner Yasuo, and you give him things like the Akali items, and you're not necessarily rerolling the Yasuo, although you could. You end up just putting these items onto Yasuo that for Akali later on. Try to get that true damage snowballing, get to level 8, get to level 9, find that Qiyana, and win from there. The only times I really consider this is, one, if I have like the items that make sense for it. Let's say I slam an Infinity Edge and I get like Not Today and it's Yasuo headliner. I do something like that. And then I push levels and I specifically go out of my way to try to take a spatula for the true damage emblem. I think that is really, really important. And the true damage emblem can go on anyone, by the way. Karthus is just an example, but you know, let's say you hit an early Vex, and instead of like playing these bruisers, you just play around a Mumu instead. You can get the true damage onto that Vex and be a really good item holder until you get that Karthus. That does it for all the comps that I want to cover that are probably going to be seen in the metagame. There's even more comps that I haven't covered that are very niche outs that I also am open to. You know, things like when do you like reroll Olaf, for example, as a 1 cost? Or can you do some really fun shenanigans with Lilia? You totally can, but they're a lot more situational than you think. So be very careful with that, and definitely experiment a lot on your own. The most important thing is to have fun. I think there's a lot of comps to explore, and many people are already saying that set 10 Remix Rumble might be the best set of TFT of all time. I'm already in that camp. I think the flexibility and the complexity of the set adds a ton of replayability, and I'm really looking forward to see how the rest of the set develops. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.